Welcome to the podcast. I can hardly believe we're already on episode 4, but here we are. This is part 4 of my series on the genocide in the Belgian Congo, and this is our final episode. We stopped the last story with the follow-up whistleblower, Edmund D Morrell, a young bilingual Irishman working for a shipping company's post in Belgium who blew the cover on Leopold's operation by beginning the slew of large-scale criticisms against Leopold II's actions in the Congo. Morel had an insider view of the administration in the Congo and a skill for publicity which would come in handy. Morel worked for a shipping company called Elder Dumpster, which controlled the ships coming back and forth from the Congo, and he had insider information as a result of his high position in Elder Dumpster. Morel came from a poor background, and he worked his way up as the company's representative in Belgium, where he had first-hand experiences with Belgium's top executives in the Congo who would travel back and forth from Antwerp to the Congo on these ships. Morel first came to his boss with his discoveries not only of injustices, but that someone had been skimming money off the top of Leopold's entire operation, and his boss assured him that Leopold II had implemented reforms in the Congo and dismissed his claims both of the fraud and the human rights violations he was so concerned about. Morel couldn't shake the belief that something suspicious was happening. He was a pretty smart guy and realized that the quantity of imports couldn't be maintained by any fair commercial enterprise, and he knew that the Africans weren't being paid in money for all of the rubber and different resources coming into Belgium. There was just no way. The numbers, unlike his boss and King Leopold, couldn't lie. E. D. Morel wasn't the type of man to remain quiet. After he brought the matter to his boss, however, he was ill-received in Brussels. The attitude around him shifted completely because he was starting to speak up over something that had previously gone unspoken about. No one wanted to talk to him, and he became a social outcast overnight for daring to question this large-scale looting operation. Morel faced wide censorship, but he wouldn't give up, and unlike other whistleblowers and other people who may have tried to speak out, he had facts and figures to back up his claims. While at this point there were growing dissenters in England, specifically Christian humanitarians, who had started to hear through the grapevine about what was happening, Morel had a completely different approach. He accused the Congo of being a state founded solely on slave labor, and he published 3 books on the subject, as well as his continuous publication in the weekly newspaper he founded, the West African Mail. Morel followed in the tradition of another English writer, Mary Kingsley, who was one of the first Europeans to recognize the African peoples as a society unto their own, rather than savages in need of civilizing, and these moral underpinnings propelled his activism. Morel described how Leopold's proprietary claims destroyed communal ideals of land ownership and fundamentally broke down social structure in the areas he colonized. Once Morel began his public dissent, he was immediately banned from visiting the Congo, which of course Leopold had the power to do, but none of this deterred Morel. He almost became the Belgian Congo version of WikiLeaks. If anyone had information they wanted to secretly leak to the press, everyone knew Morel was the guy to go to. He did phenomenal work as a journalist in that regard. So he essentially used the paper he started, the West African Mail, to publish all of these different letters that he received, etc., etc. Socialists in Belgian parliament used Morel's writings to fuel their public dissent, and as this information got out and Morel's publications spread, dissenting became less of an unpopular fringe opinion. Congo state censors suppressed a lot of information out of the Congo by reading all the letters that left the colony, but they couldn't stop foreign missionaries once their time in the Congo ended from speaking to Morel or publishing their writings in his paper. When he received lists of casualties, Morel did his best to publish the list of the names dead, giving a record of the murders perpetrated by the Belgians in the Congo. Some of the testimony from British visitors to the Congo included an incident where over 900 women and children were killed to increase rubber outputs by 20 tons for the month. So we are going to listen to another quote from King Leopold's ghost here that highlights some of the atrocities missionaries published in Morel's paper. Again, sometimes I choose quotes when I feel like the specific words will add a deeper understanding to the events we're talking about. So, the missionaries provided some of the most horrifying accounts Morel published. An American described seeing Congo state soldiers cut off someone's hand while the poor heart beat strongly enough to shoot the blood from the cut arteries at a distance of fully 4 feet. A British Baptist described a Congo state official punishing some men for stealing rubber. For this, he had them tied up right in the sun to stakes for a day and a night. They were naked and without food and water all day, and so great was their agony that their tongues were hanging out. Different letters and reports like this would be printed in the West African Mail and spread around to anyone who wanted to hear, whereas before, the general public wouldn't have had access to opinions like this, or they would be quickly quelled as fringe opinions and not taken very seriously. Morel publicly uncovered corruption at every level and eventually drew the attention of the royal palace in Belgium. A representative of Leopold's attempted to bribe Morel to get him to stop publishing, but this was not effective. By 1903, Morel and his associates succeeded on putting the Congo question at the forefront of the British consciousness, and a resolution passed in English Parliament to protest Leopold II's involvement in the Congo. This brought in another player, Roger Casement. Casement was a 2-decade veteran of traveling through Africa who had long been fervently disturbed by what he witnessed in the Congo. He was a gay man, terrified that discovery would mean the end of his career and possibly his life. But he fought as hard as he could throughout the 1880s and 90s, and when he couldn't leak details to the press, he kept meticulous journals of everything he witnessed, which allowed a light to shine on the atrocities happening abroad. When the UK protest resolution that I just spoke about in Parliament passed in 1903, the British government sent Casement to the interior to expose the truth of Leopold's operation, and he eagerly went. Unlike Morel, he was not banned from visiting. Casement had waited his entire life for an opportunity like this. His first visit to Africa had been when he was 19 years old, and what he saw had disturbed him to the core. He loathed Stanley particularly, who he had met, not just for his human rights abuses, but because he once witnessed something that truly disturbed him. Henry Morton Stanley had once become angry with his pet dog and cut off the dog's tail, cooked it, and forced the dog to eat it. Casement's investigative report could barely contain his horror. He'd been sitting on some of the different human rights abuses and mistreatment he'd seen for 20 years, and now he was being endorsed by the English government to officially uncover this. This excerpt from his journal that I've included and I will read to you remains one of our first accounts of the sheer number of mass deaths. And when we get the sense that this isn't just slavery and exploitation, but a true dictionary definition, murder of genocidal proportion. June 5th, the country a desert, no natives left. July 25th, I walked into villages and saw the nearest one. Population dreadfully decreased. Only 93 people left out of many hundreds. July 26th, poor frail folk. Dust to dust, ashes to ashes. Where then are the kindly heart, the pitiful thought, together vanished. August 6th, took copious notes from natives. They are cruelly flogged for being late with their baskets of rubber. Very tired. August 13th, A came to say 5 people from Bikoro's side, with hands cut off, had come as far as Mianga intending to show me. August 22nd. Bolongo quite dead. I remember it well in 1887, November. Full of people then, now 14 adults all told. I should say people wretched, complained bitterly of rubber tax. 6:30, on the same day, past deserted side of Bokuta. Muzere says the people were all taken away by force to Mampoko, poor unhappy souls. August 29th, Bongandanga saw rubber, quote, market, nothing but guns, about 20 armed men. Then there's a word here that I don't understand. It just says the pop in. I don't know. 242 men with rubber, all guarded like convicts. To call this trade is the height of lying. August 30th. 16 men, women, and children tied up from a village, Maboye, close to the town. Infamous. The men were put in the prison, the children let go at my intervention. Infamous, infamous, shameful system. August 31st. In the evening, a dance was organized in my honor. All the local chiefs and their wives, etc., came at L's orders to it. Poor souls, I was sorry for it. Of all the forced enjoyment I ever saw, this took the cake. September 2nd. Saw 16 women seized by Peter's sentries and taken off to prison. September 9th. 11:10, so 11:10 a.m., past Bolongo again. These poor people put off in canoe to implore my help. So there's a lot to discuss from this entry. A lot of mass death, slavery, and also you get the idea that the Belgian officials were attempting to put on a show which they had hoped would impress Roger Casement, but this did not work, and he gave his report to the British government. With this report, along with several others, the British government and press were completely shocked. They almost couldn't believe it, or they didn't want to believe it, especially when it came to some of the details that were so horrific that they really wanted to believe that this was embellishment. Details about severed hands, forcefully removing the genitals of males, and killing all the women in a village after these forced castrations so that they could keep the men for work seemed so extreme that they wanted these details to be embellishment, which unfortunately they were not embellishment at all. When Casement returned to England, he met with Morel, and they became lifelong friends and activists who considered a strategy to bring all of this to an end. These men weren't fly-by-night activists with no real convictions or petty ulterior motives. Both meant serious consequences for their actions. They would both end up in prison, and they would eventually both die, one of them in prison and the other would die shortly afterwards, kind of from the stress. At the end of the day, however, with this caveat, neither Morel or Casement were anti-imperialists, anti-racists, or socialists. Their lack of specific political affiliation made their cause, quote-unquote, safe for the nobility in England to support, and when it came to the Congo at least, this probably helped to popularize their viewpoint, as it was based in the prevailing philosophy and culture of Victorian England rather than a countercultural movement, which is sort of an interesting analysis that represents sort of the viewpoint of Hochschild, the author that I read as part of my research here. Morel knew how to attract the wealthy in English society to his side, and he wasn't above petitioning the wealthy for money and using this to his advantage. Eventually, this activist work led to widespread protests of Leopold's rule throughout Europe, which led to Leopold, ever the public relations expert, trotting out low-ranking white officials from the Congo in these mock trials to show that he was taking action against the accused atrocities. This might have worked, except court documents required evidence and required atrocities to become public record, even if the trials weren't necessarily intended to yield results. So, what may have appeared insignificant to Leopold and might have only scratched the surface of the atrocities in the Congo would have certainly exposed unheard details to the public regardless and provoked even greater questioning. I think this is interesting in context of part 1, where I talked about Leopold's inability to relate to other people. I can just imagine him thinking, oh yes, we'll do these trials, but he didn't actually expect anyone else to empathize with what they heard, which was a miscalculation, in my opinion, here, based on his own inability to relate to other people. Leopold's personal dealings, naturally, were just as shady as his genocidal side hustle, and this gave Morel an easy in to attack his character. Leopold had always been, to get straight to the point, a pedophile. It was commonly known that he liked very young girls, and he'd recently fallen in love with his mistress, a 16-year-old call girl. Everyone knew about this and found it tacky at the very least, and he became oft mocked by the press for being a grown man pathetically in love with a child. He also hated his daughters via his wife Louise, and he was well known for bestowing gifts and luxuries on his young mistress while his daughters received nothing. And the press also mocked this facet of his character. So some of the comments would sort of show the daughters gaunt and starving, like, please daddy, may we have some bread or something like that. But then the comic would show him, feeding his mistress while his daughters starved. Kind of those sorts of political hot takes were flying around Belgium at the time. He even brought the 16-year-old mistress to his cousin Queen Victoria's funeral, showing her one last time his penchant for being utterly inappropriate and disturbing to the people around him. I don't think Queen Victoria would have been surprised. Leopold II's subjects were growing increasingly angry, not just with his improper conduct, but the fact that while Leopold appeared to be enriching himself, his mistress, and his family with Congo's wealth, and building utterly useless to the majority of people public works, Belgian society was left behind. And remember, they had invested in this colonization project as well, and they felt cheated. Civil unrest in Belgium represented the beginning of this project's unraveling. So let's get back to Morel for a little bit, our most successful whistleblower to date. He started this movement called the Congo Reform Movement, and word of his project spread to Germany, where the Kaiser had personal problems with Leopold II, and despite Germany's own shady colonial actions, they allowed negative press about Leopold II to spread throughout Germany. Morel believed that Americans had a special moral imperative to end the Belgian rule in the Congo because they'd been the first country to support the Congo. So Morel is kind of going around trying to win support with the major world powers at the time, which is definitely effective strategy here. In the United States, Morel petitioned public figures as well as the President of the United States at the time, Teddy Roosevelt. Mark Twain, the writer, I think we all know him, was deeply moved by Morel's activism, and he personally lobbied in Washington several times. Twain wrote a pamphlet in 1905 called King Leopold's Soliloquy. I got through it, which I highly recommend reading if you have the time. This was essentially a satirical pamphlet. Due to Mark Twain's position in the United States, this garnered a lot of attention, so much so that King Leopold couldn't help himself. He was like Donald Trump on Twitter. He had to respond. And he did respond with a 47-page pamphlet in response to Mark Twain. Essentially, some mix of defamation and just saying that it was all lies. The usual gambit. Fake news media strikes again. Morel played the sympathies of both progressives like Mark Twain and former Confederate generals. He had his principles, Morel, and he had his agenda, and he would court whoever he had to get that agenda met. As I mentioned before, he knew how to change his message for his audience, and he petitioned Confederate generals for support by asking them how they expected to send Africans back to Africa if the continent was in no condition to receive them. I have to admit, well played, okay? Well played. In the United States, the Congo Reform Movement picked up and became a full-fledged crusade. Leopold II had his own crusades in the United States, bribing and coercing famed industrialists such as J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, and various other wealthy and influential people by either offering trading rights, artifacts from the continent, and other kickbacks. But this would not be enough to stop the oncoming storm. I mentioned the industrialists, many of whom are regarded as softcore American heroes because they did offer some complicity in Leopold's crimes. I also find it interesting that these very wealthy powers form alliances with each other because they share common interests, and I will leave my comment at that. King Leopold made an American ally, and this specific ally would have proved to be a fatal misstep for his PR campaign. He botched it. He hired an American lawyer, last name Kowalski. This guy isn't that important to the story, so we're going last name here. Kowalski was a lobbyist and a prominent figure in the American Republican Party. With Morel causing trouble in the United States, Leopold wanted to lawyer up, and he poured funds into Kowalski, moving the lawyer from San Francisco to New York. This wasn't a good move, and made Leopold look really bad. Again, Leopold was a birds of a feather flock together kind of guy, right? So there was a lot of negative press drummed up, and he chose this figure, Kowalski, to represent him. But Kowalski had this reputation as a super shady guy. He was a boisterous, bombastic nuisance, and people worked with him because he had political power, he had money, but he was really not the type of guy who you would pick if you wanted to make a stance like, I have great moral character. He wasn't known for his moral character. This looked like he was trying to cover up his actions, and possibly even use Kowalski, who, as I mentioned, was a lobbyist, to influence the US government. Newspapers ran a spread describing Kowalski as a Belgian agent in Washington, and this move turned the tides against Leopold II definitively. It's so interesting how these historical figures, they always send themselves spiraling down the drain. Their hubris, their ego, their inability to relate to other people usually ends up becoming their own undoing. So when the Kowalski drama unfolded, everybody hates Leopold now. Leopold set up a commission of inquiry into the Congo with appointed judges, he hand-selected, a Belgian, a Swiss, and an Italian. None of these judges were unbiased, as you would expect. One of them served in the Congo, and none of them spoke any African languages. But they heard 370 depositions, where witness after witness offered horrifying testimony. And this commission of inquiry, a response again to Morel's nosing around the US trying to get support, ended up sort of being the nail in the coffin, so to speak. So Leopold, despite selecting biased judges who had themselves been involved at various times, this plan to hold a sham inquiry backfired like heck. Hearing all the horrible testimony back to back to back impacted the judges. They were moved to tears by what they heard, and they lost control. The sham investigation became a real one because they were shaken to their core ethically. And the judges published a 150-page report after the inquiry. And this commission was what finally ended Leopold's domination and reign of terror. But this is where we get to the beginnings of the cover-up, and some of these practices didn't disappear overnight. So although King Leopold's reign specifically ended, that doesn't mean that, free Congo now. But this is where Leopold's domination ended. So if this is not clear for whatever reason, you can now ping me on Twitter at BLKHistoryPod. The Belgian government didn't allow anyone to read this 150-page report, including writers, historians, or journalists, until the 1980s, which may be in some of our lifetimes if you're listening to this. That is a nearly 100-year government cover-up by the Belgian government, and one of the main reasons we know such few details about the genocide. The trials of Nuremberg allowed the public to examine some of the details of the Holocaust right away. But the Belgian government actively covered up this genocide, and there were never any war crime tribunals or anything of the sort. In the previous episode, I hinted that the cover-up portion of this, why we don't know any of this, is just so deceptively simple that it's frustrating, and that's what I meant. There was a 150-page report that exposed the crimes against humanity, the 370 depositions, summarized the details of the genocide, facts, figures, numbers, estimates, personal testimony, and this was actively covered up by the Belgian government. Not just the monarchy, but the parliament was complicit in covering this up as well. Later in this episode, quite shortly, we'll get to some of the possible reasons that they may have covered this up until the 1980s. Now we need to talk about the death toll of the genocide and how this is calculated, as well as the definition of genocide, the scholarly definition, and some of my personal disagreement, or I guess not necessarily my disagreement, but my opinions on, was this a technical genocide, yes or no? Scholars of genocide sometimes describe this as a death of genocidal proportions and not a strict genocide, because this began with a quest for labor and not the desire to annihilate a specific group. The way I think about it as a layperson, at least, is that this intention ultimately renders itself irrelevant when you look at the outcome, which is why I choose to call it a genocide. Also, I do not entirely believe that there wasn't the intention to annihilate people. I think whenever people come up with these sorts of criminal enterprises, it becomes a feed-forward loop where, to cover up the crime, it propels people forward to kill anyone who could speak against them. So that is my disagreement and the technical definition. I just wanted to give you the facts and then give you my hot take. The rubber boom is the time period when the majority of the deaths were recorded, but there was also mass death prior to the rubber boom and for years after King Leopold ended his sole proprietorship over the Belgian Congo. There are 4 main factors used to calculate and estimate deaths in genocides, and these factors represent a global standard. The first is outright murder, which wasn't the most popular strategy in the Congo, but as we saw previously, was definitely common. Additionally, unlike the meticulous records kept by Nazi SS, Belgian Force Publique and other officials would not have kept such records. There are a few significant instances of mass murder where one report demonstrated 1,308 hands turned over to a Belgian official after 1 day of killing. In 1899, another state officer received 6,000 hands in a single month from his officers, but the reporting missionary estimates this number much higher, as officers murdered children with the butt of their guns and didn't bother cutting off their hands. The state also mobilized against a rebel group. I mentioned again previously that rebellions did continuously crop up, and they killed 1,300 people from the Buja ethnic group in a 1900 conflict. The list of massacres continues, with Swedish missionaries reporting parts of the lake where you couldn't walk any significant distance without witnessing bodies floating in the water, all of whom had been killed for rubber. A particular Swedish missionary notes 597 deaths during his month's stay. I'll read aloud 2 officer diaries recounting deaths from people who participated actively in this, quote, murder of genocidal proportions. The diary of another officer, Charles Lemaire, is chilling in its casualness. 28th March 1891. The village of Bokanga was burned. 4th April 1891. A stop at Bolebo. Since they wanted to meet us only with spears and guns, the village was burned. 1 native killed. Now, pieces of this diary are left out, so I'm only reading what I have. So a lot of times there's punctuation with missing parts. 12th April 1891. Attack on the Ikengo villages. The big chief, Ekele of Echimanjidu, was killed and thrown in the water. 14th June 1891. Expedition against the Loliva who refused to come to the station. Dreadful weather, attack made in driving rain. The group of villages was large, couldn't destroy them all. Around 15 blacks killed. So I'm starting to realize that when they talk about the people killed, I don't think he's talking about people who are on their side who they killed. And the villages burned are the people who they're attacking, where they killed everyone. I'm continuing to read now. 14th June 1891. At 5 a.m., sent the Zanzibari Mechudi with about 40 men to burn Nekole. The operation was successful and everything was burned. 4th September 1891. At 4 a.m., preparations for attacking Ipeko. The whole village was burned and the banana trees cut down. 13th July, 1892. The Bompopo villages were attacked. 7th July by Lieutenant Sarajin. 20 natives killed, 13 women and children taken prisoner. From the diary of Louis Leclerc, another force publique officer. 21st June, 1895. Arrived at Yambisi at 10:20 a.m. Village abandoned. We sent several groups of soldiers to scour the area. They came back several hours later with 11 heads and 9 prisoners. A canoe sent out hunting in the evening also brought back several heads. 22nd June, 1895. They brought us 3 prisoners in the morning, 3 others towards evening, and 3 heads. A man from Baumene, running through the forest, shouting for his lost wife and child, came too close to our camp and received a bullet from one of our sentries. They brought us his head. Never have I seen such an expression of despair, of fear. We burned the village. In some of these diary entries, in my interpretation, we do see explicit calls for extermination, which causes me to wonder whether the primary historian on this matter may perhaps be expressing some biases of his own in his description of a lack of intent when it comes to extermination. I do think it's likely that he's not entirely incorrect, but that intentions mutated to become more genocidal as time went on. The second factor historians look at to calculate death estimates is starvation, exhaustion, and exposure. And we see this in incredible rates in the Belgian Congo. People were conscripted as slaves into this rubber production. Not only that, but the force publique burned villages, killed women and children, and turned people into refugees, constantly on the run, which naturally opened people up to succumbing to these different factors: starvation, exhaustion, etc. The third factor is disease, which, like in many genocides, played a huge role. Europeans and Arab slavers brought diseases unfamiliar to the population, and they didn't have time to build disease resistance. In combination with other factors, this proved detrimental to the population as well. Sleeping sickness and smallpox were the largest killers, with lung infections and gastrointestinal infections playing a large role in causing mass death. In 1901 alone, the estimates are that 500,000 Congolese people died from sleeping sickness, to give you an impression of the scale these diseases killed. Leopold's PR team tried to blame everything on sleeping sickness when they learned that sleeping sickness led to so many deaths, as many genocide deniers do to this day, by the way. However, several reports have proven this to be false. Sleeping sickness alone did not cause a genocidal proportion of death. The fourth factor historians examine is a plummeting birth rate, which this region also experienced. Women tend to experience unique consequences of genocide, where the intersection of their gender and their ethnicity plays a role in what their experiences are during a genocide. Women were held hostage, subject to starvation, as well as large amounts of sexual violence, and birth rates plummeted as a result. Children were killed en masse as well, which also led to population declines. Using their best estimates of the population, as there had been no census until the early 1900s, researchers determined that Leopold II's actions led to the deaths of 10 million people. We're nearing the end of our story here, but we have details to cover critical to wrapping this up and tying it together with a grisly little bow. And here we'll get into details of the cover-up and what happened to the Congo after King Leopold. We will have to cut this relatively short in that I won't tell you about Congolese history up until the present day, but I'll give you some insight into how the Belgians left this country, a home to millions of people, diverse wildlife, and immense natural beauty. Bad press built up, and as an elderly man, Leopold changed his mind and determined that he would reverse his promise to bequeath the Congo to Belgium. He had a better plan. selling the Congo to the Belgian government. The accounting was so shoddy due to all the fraud Leopold and his various officials committed that the country entered into years-long negotiations over the sale. Leopold sold the Congo to Belgium in March 1908. The country agreed to assume the 110 million franc debt. On the bright side, 32 million francs of that debt Leopold II owed to Belgium itself. Belgium agreed to pay 45.5 million francs towards the king's pet projects, as well as installments to King Leopold himself that amounted to 50 million francs, and those funds wouldn't come from Belgian taxpayers, but the already looted Congo. After King Leopold died, or around his death, he never reconciled with his daughters from his marriage to Louise. However, he had secretly married the call girl he fell in love with, and they had 2 sons. One of those sons died early. The other lived a long, quiet life on the income from capital once wrested from the labor of Congo rubber slaves. This son died in 1984. This is where we get into the pure speculation part of the active government cover-up. This son of Leopold's died in 1984. I do not think it is a coincidence that the government withheld the 150-page report until the time near this man's death. At best, he would have been in very old age. I think this represents the complicity of Belgium in this crime against humanity, and I spoke earlier in part 1 about the United Nations and accountability for genocide. I am certain that you could still trace this money to the Belgian royal family and the country of Belgium to this day, especially knowing that the Congo didn't gain independence until, I believe, the early 1960s. I want to say 1961, but I'm off the cuff here, so I did not research this. And that, I think, is very serious, and I think requires more awareness throughout the world. If Morel could launch a campaign with his West African mail paper, one man with a moral sense, how many people with a moral sense around the world would it take for us to get some accountability surrounding this issue? Now, I'm way more cynical than I came off in the past few sentences, so I will spare you my cynicism and leave that hopeful thought when it comes to the cover-up. And this is where I'm going to end my retelling of the events in the Congo. If you want further details, I highly recommend the book I used as my primary source material for this 4-part series, King Leopold's Ghost, A Story of Greed, Terror, and Heroism in Colonial Africa by Adam Hochschild. Other books that I recommend pertaining to this subject that I've read are The Looting Machine by Tom Burgis and Africa's World War, Congo, the Rwandan Genocide, and the Making of a Continental Catastrophe by Gerard Prunier. I want to leave you with some questions to consider or a collection of final thoughts on this subject. The Belgian government actively covered up the genocide by withholding documents from journalists, academics, and the press well into the 1980s. And while it may sound like there's a global conspiracy to keep this information covered up, it is actually a quite localized conspiracy. And it makes a lot of sense considering a descendant of Leopold's lived on the stolen money until 1984, a time period which roughly coincides with the release of several of these documents, which are still very difficult for researchers to gain access to, I might add. Naturally, there have been no reparations for any of these occurrences. Current events or recent history in the Congo effectively promise that this will likely never come to fruition in my lifetime. When you learn about the Democratic Republic of the Congo or any of the surrounding states, it is easy to buy into a narrative of perpetually warring tribes, of untamed savages, and a narrative that paints an area of millions of people with a broad brush as inherently subhuman. I encourage anyone who listens to this to challenge that narrative. When you read or listen to podcasts, watch YouTube videos, or even interact with people, challenge these assumptions about African people and the African continent. and ask yourself if it is possible that your perspective may be wrong. Perhaps someone is concealing information, or perhaps you simply have not yet come across information that may change your perspective. And that is it for my 4-part Belgian Congo series. Thank you so much for listening. I will be back next week with another podcast, so don't forget to follow or subscribe so you can always have me in your pocket or blasting on your car stereo. That's where I listen to podcasts. So I officially have a Patreon where you can chip in to buy me a cup of coffee and fuel my late night research sessions. And you can find that at www.patreon.com/blackhistorypod. You can also find me on Twitter at BLKHistoryPod. In the next few weeks, I'll likely announce some premium episodes or some type of special content on Patreon. But for now, if you can slide me $3, you can get behind the scenes access to the tormented mind of a history buff and all the various research projects that I'm working on. So I will catch you in the next podcast. I look forward to telling you all about what I've been researching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye now.